Sit down for a second and take off one shoe and sock. Put that foot flat on the floor. Now, keeping the ball of your foot pressed down, try to lift just your big toe up toward your shin, as far as it will go. Watch how far it bends up. On a healthy foot, that big toe should lift up a long way, bending back toward you at a steep angle, while the ball of the foot stays planted. For a lot of people over 50, it does not. It lifts a little, then stops, stiff, and if you push it further, it feels tight or sore, or simply jammed. Note where it stops. That small movement you just tested, the big toe bending up while the rest of the foot stays down, is the single most important thing that happens at the end of every step you take. And the joint that makes it happen is one almost nobody has ever thought of as a joint at all. We think walking is about big, obvious machinery. The legs, the knees, the hips, the muscles you can see. Nobody thinks about their big toe. It sits down there at the far end of the foot, ignored, jammed into a shoe all day, and it never crosses anyone's mind that it does anything important. But the joint where your big toe meets your foot, the big toe joint, is doing something at the end of every single stride that the whole quality of your walk depends on, and when it starts to fail, it quietly rewrites how you move. This is the hidden joint. It is hidden because nobody thinks of the big toe as a joint that matters, and it is hidden because when it starts to go, it does not announce itself with a dramatic problem at the toe. It announces itself, if it announces itself at all, in ways that seem to have nothing to do with the toe. A shorter stride, a slower walk, a foot that rolls oddly, sore knees. And almost no one, patient or doctor, traces those back to one small stiffening joint at the front of the foot. Everything from here is what that joint does, why it stiffens after 50, how it changes your entire walk when it does, and what you can do about it while you still can. Because there is a window here, the same as with so many things in the body, and it is much wider earlier than later. My grandmother, well into her old age, could tell from across a room who was starting to go. She would watch how people walked toward her, and she would say things like, "So-and-so has got careful," or, "Look how short her steps have gone." She was not diagnosing anything. She could not have named a single joint or muscle in the foot. But she had watched enough people age to know that a walk changes before a person will admit anything is wrong, and that the change starts at the feet and works its way up. She read it in the stride. The science just explains what she was seeing. Start with what your big toe joint actually does the moment you push off the ground. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Watch someone walk toward you, slowly, and look only at their back foot as it leaves the ground. A step is not one movement. It is a sequence, a roll from back to front. Your heel strikes the ground first. Then your foot rolls down flat and takes your weight. Then, as your body moves forward over that planted foot, your heel lifts, your weight rolls forward onto the ball of the foot, and finally onto the big toe, and you push off into the next step. That final part, the push-off, is where all the forward drive of walking comes from. It is the engine of the whole thing, and the push-off pivots on the big toe joint. Here is what happens in that instant. As your heel lifts and your weight rolls forward, the ball of your foot and the head of that first long foot bone stay pressed against the ground, while your big toe bends upward. The joint between them extends, the toe hinging up while the bone behind it stays planted, so that your whole body can pivot forward over the top of that joint and roll off the end of the toe into the next stride. The big toe joint is the pivot. It is the hinge that every step rolls over and pushes off from. This takes a real amount of movement. To walk normally, that big toe joint has to bend up by around 60 degrees, sometimes more, on every step. That is a lot of movement from one small joint, and it has to deliver it thousands upon thousands of times a day, quietly, without you ever noticing, for your whole life. Every step you have ever taken has rolled over that joint and asked it to bend. When it bends freely, the whole thing is smooth and powerful and invisible. You plant, you roll, the toe bends up, you pivot over it, you push off, and you are into the next step without a single conscious thought. That is what a healthy walk is. and the big toe joint is doing a huge share of the work at the end of every stride to make it happen. So this small joint at the front of the foot is not a spare part. It is the pivot of your propulsion, the hinge your entire body vaults over at the end of every step. And there is a second thing it does, at that exact same moment, that is even more surprising, because the bending of the big toe does not just let you pivot, it transforms the entire foot. Your foot has a problem to solve that most people never think about, and it is a problem of being two opposite things at once. When your heel first strikes the ground, your foot needs to be soft and flexible. It has to give, spread, and absorb the shock of your body weight landing on it, like a soft bag of bones molding to the ground. But a moment later, when you push off, your foot needs to be the opposite. It has to be a stiff, solid lever, rigid enough to push your whole body weight forward against. A floppy foot cannot push off. You would just collapse over it. So the same foot has to switch, within a fraction of a second, from soft and giving to stiff and rigid, on every single step. The thing that flips that switch is your big toe joint. Running along the sole of your foot, from your heel to the base of your toes, is a thick, strong band of tissue called the plantar fascia. It wraps around the head of that first foot bone and attaches into the big toe. Now watch what happens when the big toe bends up at push-off. As the toe extends, it winds that band of tissue around the head of the bone, the way a rope winds around a drum when you turn a handle. Winding it pulls it tight, and as it pulls tight, it draws the two ends of the foot together, lifts the arch up, and locks all the bones of the foot into a stiff, rigid structure. The soft bag of bones becomes solid. In the space of that one toe movement, your flexible foot turns to stone, exactly in time to be pushed off from. This is called the windlass mechanism, and it was described by a researcher named Hicks back in the 1950s, a windlass being the old name for a drum and rope device for winding something tight. The big toe joint is the handle that drives it. When the toe bends up, the windlass winds, the arch rises, the foot stiffens, and you get a powerful push-off from a rigid lever. It is a genuinely clever piece of engineering, and it happens automatically, every step, triggered entirely by that one joint bending up. So now you can see how much rides on this joint. It is not only the pivot you roll over, it is the trigger that converts your whole foot from a shock absorber into a rigid propulsive lever, at the precise moment you need it, on every step. One small joint, doing both jobs at once. Which means that if that joint stops bending, you lose both. You lose the pivot and you lose the windlass, and the foot never becomes the stiff lever it needs to be to push off properly. That is exactly what starts to happen after 50, and it starts so quietly that almost nobody catches it. The big toe joint is a real joint, with cartilage on the ends of the bones, the smooth, slippery surface that lets them glide against each other. And like every joint with cartilage, it wears. Think about the load it has carried. A large share of your body weight rolls across that one joint at the end of every step, thousands of times a day, for decades. That is an enormous amount of use, concentrated on a small surface, over a lifetime. Over the years, the cartilage on that joint can gradually wear and roughen, and the joint can develop arthritis, and as it does, it stiffens and can become sore. This has a name. When the big toe joint becomes arthritic and stiff, it is called hallux rigidus, and the earlier, milder version where the joint is starting to lose its range is called hallux limitus. It is one of the most common arthritic conditions of the whole foot, and it becomes far more common as people move through their 50s and beyond. As the joint stiffens, it loses exactly the movement the last two chapters were about. That 60 degrees of upward bend the toe needs for a normal push-off starts to shrink, first to 50, then 40, then less, and a joint that can only bend up 30 degrees cannot do what a joint that bends up 60 degrees can. There is a second way the big toe joint goes wrong with age, and it is one people recognize more easily. The joint can drift out of line. The base of the big toe pushes outward, a bony bump forms on the inner edge of the foot, and the big toe itself starts to angle across toward the other toes. That is a bunion, and it is very common in the second half of life, more so in women, driven partly by the shape of the foot a person inherited, and partly by decades in shoes with narrow, pointed toe boxes that squeeze the toe out of line. A bunion changes the whole mechanics of the joint, and it too interferes with the clean upward bend the joint needs for a good push-off. There are a few other things that push the joint towards stiffening, and they help explain why one person's big toe joint gives out at 55 and another's holds up much longer. Old injuries matter. If you ever badly stubbed, jammed, or bent that big toe back too far, something athletes know as turf toe, you damage the joint, and a joint that has been injured is more likely to become arthritic years later. The shape of the foot you were born with matters too. Some people have a first foot bone that sits a little high or a little long, and that subtle difference changes how the joint loads and can predispose it to jamming and stiffening over the years. And carrying more body weight matters, for the plain mechanical reason that comes up again and again with joints. A large share of your weight rolls across this one small joint on every step, so more weight means more load on that surface, every step, for years. Both of these, the stiffening and the drifting, do the same thing in the end. They rob the big toe joint of its ability to extend and pivot the way it should. And here is the part that makes it hidden, the part that lets it progress unnoticed for years. The early loss is painless, or nearly so. You do not lose 60 degrees of bend overnight. You lose a few degrees at a time, slowly, over years. And losing a few degrees does not hurt, and does not obviously change anything you can feel. You are not in pain. You have not noticed your toe doing less. Everything feels normal. If you knew to look, there are early signs, but they are the kind that get shrugged off. A big toe that feels a little stiff first thing in the morning and loosens as you move. A vague ache deep in the joint after a long walk. A shoe that starts to crease or wear in a slightly different place because your foot is rolling differently. A big toe that no longer bends up as far as the one on the other foot, which most people never think to check. None of these shout for attention. They are easy to file under getting older and ignore, which is exactly what almost everyone does. But underneath, the joint is quietly giving up its range, and your body, without telling you, is already beginning to change how you walk to work around it. Which is where the real story is, because that quiet compensation is what reshapes your entire gait. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Your body has one non-negotiable job when you walk. Get your weight forward, over the foot, and into the next step. It will do that job no matter what, and if the big toe joint will not bend to let you pivot cleanly over it, your body simply finds another way. Every one of those other ways changes how you walk. The first thing that happens is that you stop rolling over your big toe and start rolling off the outer edge of your foot instead. If bending the big toe joint is stiff or sore, the body avoids it. And to avoid it, you roll your weight toward the outside of the foot and push off through the smaller, outer toes rather than over the big one. It is a workaround, and it works, in the sense that you still get forward. But it is inefficient, and it loads the outer edge of the foot in a way it was not built for, and it changes the entire path your weight takes through the foot on every step. The second thing is that your push-off weakens, and so your stride shortens. Without a clean pivot over the big toe, and without the windlass firing to stiffen the foot, the push-off loses its power. A weaker push-off means a shorter step and a slower walk, and over time the whole gait flattens out toward a shorter, more shuffling pattern. This is often the very change that gets noticed from the outside. The shortened stride, the slower pace, and it gets blamed on age in general when part of it traces to one joint at the front of the foot. The third thing runs up the chain, and this is where a foot problem stops being a foot problem. Because the windlass is not firing, the foot stays floppy through the push-off instead of stiffening into a lever. But the propulsion still has to come from somewhere. So the work that the foot should have done gets outsourced upward, onto the calf, the knee, and the hip, which now have to do more to move you forward because the foot is no longer pulling its weight. The altered roll and the outer edge loading change the mechanics at the ankle and the knee as well. A joint that stops doing its job does not just go quiet. It forces everything above it to compensate. And compensation upstream is how a stiff toe becomes a sore knee and a tired hip. And the fourth thing is that it feeds itself. This is the trap. The more the joint stiffens, the more you avoid bending it, and the more you avoid bending it, the more it stiffens, because a joint keeps the range you actually use and gives up the range you stop asking for. Avoid the movement, and you lose more of the movement, which makes you avoid it more. The joint and the habit wind each other tighter, year after year, which is why this tends to accelerate once it starts. There is one more consequence worth naming. The big toe and that final push-off are part of how you stay balanced at the end of a step, in the moment your weight is rolling forward off one foot. A big toe joint that is not doing its job weakens that final push and that late step stability, and reduced stability in walking is part of what raises the risk of stumbles and falls as people get older. So a stiff big toe joint is not only about a shorter stride, it is quietly tied to how steady you are on your feet. Put it all together and the answer to the title is clear. A stiffening big toe joint is not a toe problem. It shortens your stride, slows your pace, shifts your weight to the outside of your foot, changes what your knees and hips have to do, and chips at your balance. It decides how you walk, precisely because it sits at the end of every step, and almost no one knows to look at it. And that is the real reason it stays hidden for so long. Think about how the problem actually shows up. A person notices their knee aches, or their hip is tired at the end of the day, or that they walk slower than they used to, or that one shoe wears down oddly on the outer edge. They go looking at the thing that hurts, the knee, the hip, and often nothing conclusive turns up there, because the knee and the hip are not the source. They are compensating. The source is a small joint at the far end of the foot that has quietly lost 20 degrees of bend, painlessly, over a decade, and almost nobody, patient or clinician, thinks to connect an aching knee to a stiff big toe. The chain of cause and effect runs from the toe upward, but the attention runs the other way, to wherever it hurts, which is never where it started. So the joint keeps stiffening, unexamined, while everything above it takes the blame. Since the problem is a joint losing the movement it needs, the aim is to protect and keep that movement for as long as possible, and to work the whole foot that depends on it. And there are honest limits to be clear about, which matter here. Start with the range itself. The single most useful thing is to keep the big toe joint moving through the bend it is losing, gently and regularly, because a joint keeps the range you ask of it. Taking the big toe through its upward bend by hand, easing it back toward the shin to the comfortable end of its range and holding it there, moving it deliberately rather than letting it sit jammed in a shoe all day, keeps the joint from tightening down faster than it has to. This is the same principle that governs every joint in the body. Use the range or lose it. A joint that gets taken through its movement stays more mobile than one that never does. Be honest about the limit, though. If the joint is already significantly arthritic, with the cartilage genuinely worn, you cannot stretch that back. The cartilage does not regrow, and no exercise reverses established arthritis. What the movement work does in that case is help you keep and use whatever range is left, and slow the loss, rather than restore what is gone. And an advanced, painful, arthritic big toe joint is something to have properly assessed and managed by a doctor or a podiatrist, not something to force through stretching. Second, strengthen the foot and the toe. The muscles that stabilize and drive the big toe can be woken up and worked. Pressing the big toe down firmly into the floor while keeping the rest of the foot relaxed, and learning to do it deliberately, trains the muscle that controls that toe. Doming the arch by drawing the ball of the foot slightly toward the heel without curling the toes, which is harder than it sounds, trains the small muscles that support the whole structure. A strong, well-supported foot works better around the joint and takes some of the strain off it. Third, and this one is genuinely two-sided, is footwear. On one hand, tight, narrow, pointed shoes crowd the big toe joint and are one of the main drivers of the drift that becomes a bunion, so giving your toes room matters, especially over a lifetime. On the other hand, and this surprises people, if the joint is already stiff and painful with arthritis, a stiffer-soled shoe, or one with a curved rocker sole that helps your foot roll forward without demanding the toe bend as far, can actually reduce the pain by taking load off the joint. So the right footwear depends on which situation you are in. Room and flexibility to prevent problems and keep a healthy joint moving. More support and less demand on the joint to manage one that is already worn. It is worth knowing that these pull in different directions, rather than assuming one shoe answers everything. And walk through your whole foot with some intention, rather than letting yourself roll off the side to dodge the toe while the joint still allows it. Managing your weight helps too, for the plain reason that every extra bit of body weight is extra load rolling across that small joint on every step, the same arithmetic that applies everywhere in the body. The theme is simple: keep the joint moving and the foot strong while you can, and respect the limits of a joint that is already worn. Pull the whole picture together, and the answer to the title stops being mysterious. The big toe joint is the pivot that every step rolls over and pushes off from. It is the trigger for the windlass that turns your soft foot into a rigid lever at the exact moment you need it. It carries a large share of your weight at the end of every stride, thousands of times a day, for your whole life. And after 50, quietly and often painlessly at first, it stiffens, through arthritis, through a bunion, or through the simple habit of avoiding a movement that has started to feel tight. When it can no longer bend the way it should, your body works around it, and every workaround changes how you walk. A shorter stride, a slower pace, a roll toward the outer foot, new load on the knees and hips, and a chip taken out of your balance. It is the hidden joint that decides how you walk, hidden only because no one thinks to look at the toe, and because the early loss makes no noise at all. Now the part that matters most, the safety line. Some big toe joint problems are not something to stretch or exercise. See a doctor or a podiatrist if your big toe joint is painful, swollen, developing a bony lump, or getting stiff or deformed noticeably faster. And treat it as urgent, not as ordinary stiffness, if you get a sudden attack of severe pain with redness and heat in the big toe joint, because that is the classic sign of gout, a genuine medical condition that needs proper treatment rather than a stretch. If you have diabetes, take any foot problem seriously and have it looked at by a professional, because reduced sensation and slower healing make foot issues far more dangerous and easy to miss. None of the movement work in this video is a substitute for getting a painful, hot, swollen, or rapidly changing joint properly assessed. The exercises are for keeping a reasonably healthy joint mobile, not for treating one that is trying to tell you something. For everyone whose big toe joint is simply starting to stiffen with the years, the message is the one my grandmother understood without any of the anatomy. She watched people's walks change as they aged, the steps getting shorter, the feet getting careful, and she would tell you to keep moving, to walk properly, not to shuffle, to stay on your feet. She had no idea that a small joint at the end of the foot, taken through its bend on every step, was a big part of what kept a walk a real walk. She just knew that the people who kept their feet working kept walking well, and the ones who let them seize up did not. The change in your stride starts further down than anyone looks. It starts at the joint you have never once thought about. Take your shoe off tonight and bend that big toe. See how far it goes, then keep it moving, while it still moves. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. Watched people's walks change as they aged, the steps getting shorter, the feet getting careful, and she would tell you to keep moving, to walk properly, not to shuffle, to stay on your feet. She had no idea that a small joint at the end of the foot, taken through its bend on every step, was a big part of what kept a walk a real walk. She just knew that the people who kept their feet working kept walking well, and the ones who let them seize up did not. The change in your stride starts further down than anyone looks. It starts at the joint you have never once thought about. Take your shoe off tonight and bend that big toe. See how far it goes, then keep it moving, while it still moves. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.